All right. Why don't we go ahead and get started? Aloha kako. My name is Dawn Sueoka, and I am the Congressional Papers Archivist at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Thank you so much for joining us today for James Arcedias' talk, Hiram Fong's Asian America, Reflections on His Impact and Legacy. So my job in the library is to manage the papers of Hawaii's post-statehood members of Congress, such as Senator Daniel K. Inouye, Senator Spark M. Matsunaga, Congressman Neil Abercrombie, and of course, Senator Hiram L. Fong. Our collections represent the archives of the members' DC offices and Hawaii offices. So they document topics such as land, the military, agriculture, tourism, health, education, anything, especially in Hawaii, that has any kind of federal dimension. And so every year, the Congressional Papers Collection offers a $5,000 travel award to a non-Oahu-based researcher, and also a $5,000 award to a UH Manoa graduate student, if people who want to conduct research in one or more of our congressional collections. And James is the recipient of our 2024-25 Travel Award. And today he's going to be sharing a little bit about his research in the Hiram Fong papers. Before we get started, I just wanted to mention that the talk is being recorded and it may be posted. James is going to be presenting for about 40 to 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have a time for Q&A at the end. So please put any questions that you might have in the Q&A. And I and my colleague Morgan Schmidt, who's assisting with today's presentation, will keep an eye on the Q&A. Okay, with that, I will go ahead and introduce James. James Arcedias is an award-winning historian of the United States. He is Associate Professor of History and Director of the Yu Cheng Cho Philippine Studies Program at the University of San Francisco. His first book, Resisting Change in Suburbia, Asian Immigrants and Frontier Nostalgia in LA, won the Organization of American Historians 2023 Lawrence W. Levine Award for the best book in American cultural history. He's currently conducting research for his second book project, which is a history of Asian American conservative, libertarian, and Republican Party activism since the Cold War. And with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you, James. Mahalo again.
Thank you, Dawn, so much. First of all, thank you everyone who's here today. I really appreciate you taking time to share this space and learn a little bit about not just Hiram Fong, but just kind of how Asian Americans have engaged in the political right over time. So I want to thank again Dawn Sueoka. I want to thank Morgan Schmidt for helping coordinate all of this. I really appreciate it and know that especially this time of the semester, things get a little bit busy. So I really, again, I'm very appreciative. And Dawn, especially, you've been such a tremendous resource and just have been so helpful. So UH is very lucky to have you there. So thank you again. So I want to keep it pretty casual, the presentation today, partly because I'm still early in the research phase, and which is partly why, again, I'm very grateful for the grant that I received to sift through the Hawaii Congressional Papers collection at Hamilton Library, because actually, in many ways, has been my starting point in the research for this second book, which is tentatively called The Asian American Conservative, Making Space and Shifting Power Since the Cold War. And in a way, I'm starting in the kind of the early Cold War period, partly because of figures like Hiram Fong. And so that's really kind of what brought me to UH Manoa to kind of explore a little bit more about who he is, look through his records, look through the memorabilia and other documents that were left behind. And I will say that in case you want to learn more, there's a website on that I helped put together that on the UH site. Maybe Morgan will pull up some point, but some primary sources and bibliography and some keywords are there as well. So those of you who are educators or just curious You can access those. Hopefully, they're good resources for you to kind of understand a little bit about Hiram Fong and what I've found so far. So, so yeah, let's start there. So as a historian, let me just show you really switch here real quick. Um, as a historian, I'm interested in some of these broader questions about, particularly cultural and political history. And as Dawn mentioned, my first book, Resisting Change in Suburbia, is ultimately about Asian American suburbanization in Southern California, focused primarily on Chinese, Korean, and Filipino immigrants and their families who settle in Southern California between particularly from the 1980s through the early 2000s. And why this relates to my second book, which I hope will be my second book, The Asian American Conservative, is because some of the themes from that book, it's kind of an offshoot where I talk about Asian, particularly middle and upper middle class or affluent Asian immigrants who build lives for themselves in the suburbs of Southern California, but very much focused on or very much invested in trying to chase out the so-called American dream, one that is rooted in the suburbs, one that is rooted in the single family home, one that is very much focused on kind of building a more conservative lifestyle politically and culturally in these spaces. And what I talk about in the book is how Asian immigrants, particularly from Hong Kong, Taiwan, Philippines, South Korea, and other members of the diaspora, how they engage in local politics. Things like NIMBYism, right? Things about around land use, the politics of education. So things like how K through 12 education is being taught, what schools their children are being sent to, or maybe opposition to what are considered controversial developments like a landfill or an apartment complex, or things like certain retail spaces like a Target, which, a Target wouldn't necessarily be seen as controversial, but in the 1990s, it was kind of seen very as lowbrow, kind of like a Walmart, and kind of you see opposition to that from some Asian immigrants. And so I kind of talk about how they get involved in local politics in that regard. And a lot of it is not necessarily them as people who are registered Republicans per se, but they have conservative views around how to live their lives in the United States, especially of a certain generation who came here during the Cold War, who were very much invested in following a particular pathway to defining themselves as quote unquote upstanding citizens of America, right? And so that first book delves into some of those elements of Asian American right-wing conservative libertarian and/or Republican activism. And so what I hope to do with this book is to broaden that scope, but to tell a history of that, right? And again, needn't be partisan necessarily, right? You could be a registered Democrat and have conservative views. You can be a registered Republican and have more liberal views. And everything in between, right? So that's what I hope to accomplish with this second book, again, tentatively called The Asian American Conservative. So I want to spend the first few minutes here talking about Senator Hiram Fong. I know I'm talking to an audience from Hawaii, so I'm sure that some of you already know quite a bit about him. But for those who don't know as much about him, I want to kind of lay a foundation here. And during Q&A, I'm happy to hear also if you have thoughts of what you know about Senator Fong, or if you have maybe even personal experiences in some cases with him and his relatives. But Hiram Fong, a little bit about who he is. So I'll just kind of read a little bit here. In 1959, you can see those bullets there. In 1959, voters in the newly admitted state of Hawaii sent the first Asian American and Chinese American to the United States Senate, Hiram L. Fong. Born to Chinese immigrants and raised in Honolulu's Kalihi neighborhood in 1906, Fong fashioned himself a working man who moved up the ranks of society. According to some of his campaign flyers that I came across in the archive at UH, as a kid, he picked mesquite beans to sell as cattle field, shined shoes, sold newspapers, and caught and sold fish and crabs. So he very much positioned himself as a working class gentleman that, again, worked his way up in society. He served 2 years in the U.S. military during World War II, received a bachelor's degree from University of Hawaii at Manoa. So he worked his way through college as a student. So again, really leaning into his more modest background. Obtained a law degree from Harvard and started his own firm of Fong, Miho, Choi, and Robinson. And in one of the campaign brochures, he noted, and this to me feels like someone who specialized in Asian American history, very Hawaii specific thing, he made sure that he noted the ethnicity of each of these partners. So he said Fong, quote, in parentheses, Chinese, Miho, I hope I'm saying that correctly, Miho, Japanese, Choi, in parentheses, Korean, and Robinson, in parentheses, quote, Caucasian dash Hawaiian. So it was interesting to see that he made that specification there. In 1952, Fong started Finance Factors, a business in which the people he worked with helped bolster his reputation across the islands. And so, again, in the archive, Finance Factors was quite a key player throughout his professional career as well, or political career as well. As a young attorney, he got involved in territorial politics and was instrumental in pushing for statehood. Fong's business connections throughout Hawaii, along with his diplomatic relationships he had in Asia, sustained his decades-long political career. And so, as I say here, as you can see on the slide here, he had some notable achievements, and I would argue, generally speaking, and as I said, I'm early in the research here, that in some ways Fong set a standard for an ideological framework for Asian American Republican politics, really until the 1980s or 1990s even. And I would argue that really when we get to the 2000s, the Republican Party takes on a different orientation and shape. Partly, when we reach the kind of George W. Bush post 9/11 era, Tea Party era, and all of that. And so I would say that Fong kind of laid down a foundation of a Republican Party that, for all intents and purposes, many would argue does not exist anymore, especially in a post 2015, 2016 Trump, realignment of this kind of right-wing populism, right? Okay. So I want to show some of these, since we're here to also talk about what I've found in the archive. Again, this is just a couple of clippings of dozens that I came across in the archive. And so many of the newspaper coverage and paid campaign advertisements really did lean into his, again, kind of, he worked his way up, pulled himself up from his bootstraps, very much this kind of American dream story. In this case, this one piece, the Hawaiian success story, right? He said there, his father earned $12 a month and now he's running for Senate. And of course, as you know, he would eventually win. And the visual on the right side is one of a few advertisements that he put in papers and later in his career. And at that point, he'd been a much more established politician and figure in Hawaii. So, as the first and only Republican to have represented Hawaii in Congress's upper chamber, of course, as you know, in the House, you had Pat Saiki, but in terms of the Senate, it was just Fong as a Republican. Fong's personal background and legislative profile mirrored that of many Cold War-era Asian Americans on the right. Fong was, by most definitions, a moderate Republican. He supported U.S. military interventions in Southeast Asia, was a staunch advocate of Taiwan. I came across quite a bit of very pro-Taiwan literature in the archive from him, and was a friend of business, including the tourism industry, pineapple and sugar industries, and of course, banking and loan companies that he worked with or was owning, right? So something I came across regularly in the archive was, these his campaign lists of supporters or people who were giving fundraising contributions. So Hawaiian Airlines, United Airlines, various hotels, again, some of these major plantation companies and industries throughout the island. So he clearly had had a reach there. At the same time, Fong was able to win over voters in Democratic strongholds because he was, interestingly, also a friend of labor, although some of those ties deteriorated in later years, including his relationship with the International Longshore and Warehouse Union. And I will say that towards the end of his political career, at least in the Senate, it was very fractured. There were some very public scuffles, if you will, at least exchange of words between labor union leaders and himself, feeling as if he really betrayed them once he became more established as a senator. Moreover, Fong championed civil rights at a time when the GOP increasingly embraced the so-called Southern strategy. That is, courting rural whites and disaffected Sun Belt suburban settlers who were wary of social change, suspicious of city dwellers in the age of the urban crisis, and critical of the civil rights, ethnic nationalist, feminist, gay liberation, free speech, and counterculture movements happening across the United States. And so, of course, just a quick background there, right? In the 1960s, when Hiram Fong was, really at the height of his career, some would argue, the Republican Party was changing tremendously. And you had the kind of move away, and I have some of this on the website that I put together for the library there. The Republican Party moving away from its traditional, at that point, traditionally strongholds of a kind of Northeast, kind of middle of the road, even in some cases liberal Republican platforms, to one that kind of the pendulum swung a little bit more to the right, especially as the Republican Party started to invest more in suburban voters, in Sun Belt and deep Southern voters, trying to take in, right, kind of siphoning off some of those Southern Democratic voters of the Deep South, right? So again, the party's in a realignment. And Fong, in some ways, was kind of at that crossroads where he was still kind of clinging on to what was the Republican Party at the time, and then moving towards also what the Republican Party would be for the remainder of the 20th century, right? Fong, in 1964, as a delegate to the Republican National Convention in San Francisco, so where I am currently based, his name was placed in the ring as a presidential nominee, making him the first Asian American to receive delegate votes at a major party convention. This is a picture of him in San Francisco. I believe it was at Cow Palace, if you know that venue in San Francisco, or at least it used to be around. As Hawaii's so-called favorite son, as he was often his kind of the moniker name that he was given, his name was placed again for nomination in 1968 when the Republican Party met in Miami. And a little bit of, again, background of political history. If you know about 1968, obviously a very pivotal year internationally. There were a lot of unrest around the world, and student protests and youth activism. But in the case of 1968, between the two parties, Republicans met in Hawaii, and there was a lot of unity in Hawaii, rallying behind Richard Nixon. The Republican Party couldn't be more aligned, even though they had obviously some ideological fractures between kind of a more hard right Republican Party and a middle of the road one. But in contrast, the Democratic Party was meeting in Chicago, and a lot of people know about what happened in 68 in Chicago. There were riots on the streets, a lot of anti-war activism, people very upset at Lyndon Johnson and how the Vietnam War was kind of led. And so there was so much criticism and police violence and just scuffles happening in Chicago. And so when voters, right, some political historians would argue that when some voters would see this on television, right, they're turning on the CBS Even News or NBC, and Walter Cronkite's recapping the day, and they're like, the Republican Party looked at the time like they had their act together, right? And the Democratic Party had all these divisions between the kind of more moderate, kind of Cold War Democrats, and then the kind of more progressive faction, right? And so that's an interesting kind of contrast there. So anyway, in the Senate, Fong had prestigious appointments in the Judiciary and Appropriations Committees, where he built relationships with powerful GOP figures like Jacob Javits of New York, Barry Goldwater of Arizona, and Bob Dole of Kansas. And of course, as you know, the latter two would eventually become presidential nominees themselves. Fong served 3 terms, leaving office in 1977, though with significantly less favorability compared to when he started. Much of this attributed to his fractured relationship with unions and younger voters, his stance on staying the course in Vietnam, and his fervent support for Richard Nixon, even amid the Watergate scandal. And so, when I was in the archive there at Hamilton, I came across just innumerable letters from students, actually from UH, who were talking about how they were frustrated with Hiram Fong. Many of them actually even voted for him early in his career, and they felt very disappointed and let down at how he really doubled down on the U.S. presence in Southeast Asia, right? Especially in Vietnam and, of course, in Cambodia. There was a whole another wave of letters I remember coming across about how students were very frustrated with how he was feeling towards the interventions in Cambodia. And then again, similarly, a lot of disappointment across Hawaii from his constituents who really were disappointed in that he was not only standing alongside Richard Nixon amid the accusations of Watergate, but even after everything kind of, came to light, that Nixon was hiding and was colluding and all of these other things, he still very much considered Nixon a friend. And so he did not distance himself, which was, again, quite fascinating. I'd have to say quite bold, and that would be the nail in the coffin of your political career. So I guess it didn't, I'm kind of curious to see I'm curious to know, why he really stood by him. But from what I gather, my suspicion is that what I saw in the archive is that they had quite a bit of correspondence throughout Hiram Fong's time as a senator, and I think they had a true friendship there, right? And I think that made it very hard for him to kind of throw him under the bus, right? Nixon under the bus. And so I'm kind of kind of curious in the kind of psychology behind that as well. So, though he willingly retired, Hawaii's so-called favorite son paid the price for sticking to his guns as a rank-and-file partisan, and for what was seen as an unwillingness to adjust to shifting cultural mores or public opinion. Some may say Fong's decisions are examples of political conviction, while others say that maybe that was or is not how to play the game. At any rate, Fong's career opened the door for a louder, more powerful Asian American right in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. So with that as context, and of course, there's so much more to say about him and his career, but just to kind of give you a kind of a foundation, I want to spend the rest of the time today reflecting on what I learned about Hiram Fong as I examined his papers at the archive, and some points and provocations to consider as I move forward with this project. Again, I'm still early in this, and so I'm kind of sorting out, kind of understanding not only Hiram Fong, but what was the Republican Party at that time as it relates to Asian Americans, right? And what was their level of activism? I think that's kind of one of the main challenges in doing this research is there's not a lot documented, right? Not Asian American history is already a huge and can be difficult enterprise because again, the lack of sources and documents that are available. But at the same time, thinking about a specific group, right? Those who are very much engaged in the political right. So for the book, I'm putting a spotlight on Hiram Fong, partly because he was the first Asian American in the Senate, but really because his correspondence, speeches, photographs, and ephemera illustrate the complicated relationship Asian Americans had and still have with the broader American right. Throughout Fong's time in the Senate, he was able to gain the trust of elite GOP players because of his connection to leaders, diplomats, and business people in Hong Kong, Japan, and the Philippines, countries with important geopolitical ties to the US, and because of his roots in what was seen as the resource-rich trans-Pacific quote-unquote frontier of Hawaii. Moreover, Fong, a child of immigrants, a veteran, a holder of multiple degrees, a reputable attorney, and a Washington power player, embodied an American success story. He therefore symbolized a type of racial liberalism his fellow conservatives and white colleagues promoted around the world. That is, a person of color living in a democratic America who wholeheartedly embraced the system and has reaped the benefits in spite of it being a political and economic order ultimately designed to keep communities like those of Fong's constituencies at the bottom. Fong and other quote-unquote successful Asians were the people of color at the table in the halls of power, but it's a seat and position they had to fight for by doing things the so-called correct way. And because they did, Asian American conservatives championed policies from the perspective of, if I can do it, how come they can't? An attitude fueling current waves of Asian American right-wing populism, right? And so I think just to kind of, broaden the zoom out from it and thinking about where the Asian American right today is, that's something I'd like to kind of tackle towards the end of more like an epilogue of my book, is thinking about how you hear a lot of Asian Americans who are opposed to affirmative action, opposed to immigration reform that's a little bit more liberal, kind of using that logic of, well, I did it, how come they can't, right? And so that's something to make note of. What's interesting is that as Fong left office in 1977, across the way in California, my home state, fellow Republican S.I. Hayakawa, a Japanese American born in Canada, was making waves in the Senate as the Golden State's newest U.S. senator. Fong and Hayakawa didn't overlap in Congress. But had that been the case, it would have been fascinating, as I said, to see where they agreed or disagreed in terms of policy, ideology, and approach. Whereas Fong was typically seen as even-tempered, Hayakawa was quite the firebrand and provocateur. Here's a picture of him. Well, one of his claims to fame, if you will, was when he was president of San Francisco State College, at the time college, now university. He was very much opposed to the student protests. Their students were demanding for a more open admissions, especially for students of color. They were demanding more faculty of color and staff of color at San Francisco State College. And then they were mostly demanding for ethnic studies, right? So what would eventually be known as African American and Black studies, Chicana studies at the time as it was known, but of course now today Latinx or Latina studies, indigenous studies, and of course Asian American and Pacific Islander American studies. And so he had very much a strong disdain for these students' demands. And what's complicated about S.I. Hayakawa, and this is another figure I'm going to tackle in the book, and I bring him up because in a way is an interesting contrast to Hiram Fong, both Republicans, both Asian American, is that Hayakawa is very much pro-assimilationist, but he was also very much, did not hide his Japanese heritage, but he had this very, what some would say, maybe even naive understanding of multiculturalism. And I think that's where where Hayakawa and Fong differed in terms of their approach to acknowledging their Asian American heritage and how they engaged with their Asian American communities. Fong, as I saw throughout the records and boxes I went through at UH, um, Fong had such deep ties with Asian American civic organizations, not even just in Hawaii, but across the United States. Letters from Chinese associations and benevolent associations in New York, in New England, in the Midwest, and of course, certainly in California. And I don't think Hayakawa had that same type of relationship that Fong had. And so that's quite interesting to me. And then the last point I'll share about some of these last point I want to share before I share some specific sources I came across is that unlike Fong's white counterparts in the GOP conference in the Senate, Fong often found himself dealing with unique circumstances and challenges likely tied to his race, ethnicity, and physical location of Hawaii. To be sure, like any statewide or federal leader, one must cater to multiple groups and cobble together diverse coalitions to retain power and relevance. For Fong, however, it was crucial he had allies in Hawaii, across the US, and around the world because of the people he represented. It was not unusual for him to deal with complicated casework related to immigration or civil rights, organize multilingual events for constituents. I have to emphasize that that was quite unusual for the time, right? To have a US senator have town halls where they're speaking Japanese and English and different dialects of Chinese, right? Maybe even Tagalog in some cases. He had a relationship also with a lot of Filipinos across the island. Or having to attend not only mainstream GOP events, but also a lot of what would be considered today, kind of now it's become somewhat pejorative for some on the right, these diversity, equity, inclusion events. He had these events that were in many ways what would be considered like multicultural outreach. And so Fong was dispatched in some ways by the party, the National Party, to promote diversity, partly because of his background, but also he very much, it seemed, right, that was one of his kind of hallmark characteristics or priorities, if you will, of being a senator from Hawaii was to really promote, especially the AAPI community, right? So I want to show some slides or some images now of what I came across at the archive. There's so many. I took I didn't get a final count in, but I'm quite certain several hundred images at least while I was at UH. I'll kind of break it down thematically. So one is Hiram Fong as I say, a Cold War broker, an advocate of Trans-Pacific relations, and someone that really advocated for improved US-Asia relations. So in many examples of correspondence, he was very clear about his position in support of Taiwan. He had these diplomatic ties with folks in Taiwan. He was very much opposed to what he saw as the overreach of communist China in a lot of trade or other forms, especially during the Cold War and other areas of politics. He wanted to establish these good relationships, especially with Japan. There were a lot of documents I came across in the archive of promoting Japanese tourism, at least tourism from Japan to Hawaii. And he was very much instrumental, at least I would argue, instrumental in those early years of trying to encourage people from Japan to visit Hawaii. And so, here again is some of the pieces that I came across. His name, as you can see here, this is an ad that was put in the Washington Post in 1961. So at that point, he'd only been in office for about a year and a half, or less than a year and a half. And his name is below the fold. I'll show you here at the top there in the center. You can see his name. And so again, very critical of China, like a lot of Republicans, but also a lot of Democrats at the time. And again, very pro-Taiwan in his politics. Another theme I would argue, at least as I would sort through this paperwork, is Hiram Fong as a civil rights and immigration reform advocate. Now, one thing I came across quite a bit in the archive was that Hiram Fong really, I think, from what I saw in his collections, really invested in immigration policy, right? And I think that's one of the things that he's known for. And he seemed to be quite the policy wonk around immigration matters. So he collected, at least in the archive, had quite a range of perspectives on immigration policy. So he had, like, for example, a pamphlet from AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, which is a right-wing political think tank. But in the same box, right, or same folders, he had paperwork from more liberal organizations that were trying to advocate, right, for much more open and more porous borders. And so it was very clear that he wanted to liberalize not immigration altogether, but in many aspects of immigration restrictions that had been in place up until 1965 because of, again, decades of restrictive immigration policies that really started with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, right? And so he was very much instrumental in pushing for the Hart-Celler Immigration Act of 65 and other policies that would follow. One thing that I came across was that Hiram Fong was very much invested in trying to remove the country of origin of where you're born on your passport. And he, kind of believed that that was going to result in biases at the border and kind of certain types of treatment and profiling. That was quite interesting to see. And so I didn't come across a ton of information, but there were several forms of correspondence of him expressing his views on that and wanting to eradicate that. He was also instrumental and supportive, very supportive of the Civil Rights Act of 64, as you can see here. And again, very much someone that gained a reputation as someone that was advocating for these reforms, especially at a time when the civil rights movement was really in full swing. On the lower 48, right? There was a lot of, obviously, clearly a lot of civil rights activism in the Deep South, but really across the West. And you can see here that he was appointed to the Civil Rights Subcommittee. This was when, before Johnson came into office, this is when JFK was still, pushing for some of this. And so you can see he had a Senator Eastland, Democrat of Mississippi, announced the appointment of Senators Fong of Hawaii and Kennedy of Massachusetts and Bai of Indiana, right? You can see again the appointments he had. Another letter, I mean, there are so many, but I just want to give as one form of many examples of kind of how, again, he received a lot of letters, advocating, lobbying for certain types of policies around immigration. And again, these associations and unions were very instrumental in kind of building that relationship with Fong. And they really had his ear in many ways. Another theme I came across was Hiram Fong as the face of diversity for the Republican Party. I would say that in some ways, Fong was often seen as the poster child of as a Republican of color. And again, he was often called the favorite son of Hawaii, the man of the Pacific. This was a phrase that he embraced himself. And I came across a lot of ephemera, a box full of campaign memorabilia that was kind of fun to go through. He had these paper hats that said "Man of the Pacific," red, white, and blue. Kind of, again, you don't really see that type of material anymore, but he was often seen as someone that was, again, who could kind of in some ways, push for a more diverse Republican Party. And it's again in some ways in contrast to where the Republican Party was moving towards in the 1960s, and at a time when the Republican Party was really trying to attract a lot of white voters, again, in the Sun Belt and in the Deep South that were, again, very disenchanted with the Democratic Party's shift to the left, right? And so that was something to see. I'll share a little bit more, some images. As we know, he was nominated for the presidency, or at least received enough delegate votes, or some delegate votes for the presidency. And he advocated for a lot of Asian American activism within the party. And so you're seeing here an invitation to a fundraiser. He had these kind of like luau's and rallies. He again really leaned into his Hawaiian heritage and some of these, or background that is, in terms of being from Hawaii. And he held these fundraisers in like places like Virginia or outside DC. And I saw correspondence from his Senate colleagues saying, from colleagues from the Midwest or from far West states or from the South, saying, I had a blast. I loved the luau. It was nice to eat. All that pineapple, and kind of very leaning into a lot of these stereotypes of Hawaiian cuisine. But they really thought that, again, really leaning into his kind of island background. And you can see here again, the man of the Pacific, a lot of his campaign materials positioning him as, in some ways, as this kind of person between East, West, Pacific, and the so-called lower 48, someone that was seen as this diplomat in some ways, this cultural diplomat between what I would argue is this kind of trans-Pacific slash Asian bridge between Asia and the US especially. And then again, here's correspondence I came across. I know it's a little hard to read, but this is from someone from Hong Kong, and they said that when they saw him on television receiving some delegate votes to be nominated as president during the Republican National Convention in '64. There was this local group of course, Chinese in Hong Kong that were just celebrating and really took a lot of pride in this moment, right? Seeing someone that they saw as someone that looked like them, on the Republican National Convention floor, being nominated for, what is considered, of course, the most prestigious position in the land. A couple more I wanted to share. He again had a lot of ties with Chinese and other Asian associations outside of Hawaii, and you can see that he was very invested in also building those connections with Asian American Republicans. In this case, here's some activists in New York pushing for Barry Goldwater, who again was the Republican nominee. This is just fun. I wanted to share this. I thought this was just a fun image in some ways of kind of, again, kind of pushing voting for the Republican Party. Now, again, my assumption is that the names in the back there are all the candidates who are Republican candidates for various state offices in Hawaii. Notice, very gendered. There are no women, as far as I can see, or very few. There's a couple, I think, in this image, but apart from that, very, very male forward there. And Hiram Fong as a figure of post-war Asian America. So this is kind of what I said earlier that I found particularly interesting. Hiram Fong represented Hawaii in the Senate. But if you were Asian in the United States, he was kind of your senator too, it seemed to be. He was getting correspondence from people in Florida, in Pennsylvania, in Rhode Island, in Illinois, in California. They have obviously their own two US senators, but Hiram Fong, and they're probably reaching out to them as well. But Hiram Fong received these letters of issues that US citizens and immigrants especially were dealing with. And he kind of became this person that was helping with constituent issues not only in Hawaii, but trying to help Asian Americans across the US who are dealing with immigration problems or something with their business. And so he kind of became, someone that would help with a lot of constituent issues. There were some, for example, I remember I didn't want to put it up here just to protect privacy, right? But there was, I think, a constituent that I think their relative, a constituent in Hawaii, their relative was like stuck in the Philippines because martial law, broke out in the Philippines during the Marcos regime. There was some very complicated immigration issue, and Hiram Fong stepped in and kind of, took matters into his own hands, if you will. And so he kind of became this go-to guy. And as I say here, everyone's representative in DC. And if there were people who didn't even live in the US and they wanted to help, they needed some assistance with something that was tied to something between, let's say, Taiwan and US relations or Hong Kong and US relations, they reached out to Hiram, right? And I'm sure they were probably reaching out to other officials as well. But the letters were very personal, kind of like, you are our Asian person in the Senate. Can you help us out here, right? Of course, there would be other members who would join in, right? Other, of course, Japanese American Democrats who would serve in the Senate representing Hawaii. But at least in the early years, especially his early years in the Senate, Hiram Fong was kind of the go-to person, right? And so that was also very fascinating. Here you can see again, I'm just going to pull up some telegrams here. Just a lot of praise for Hiram Fong. Again, he kind of became this hero of Chinese America, especially. And a lot of pride, kind of bipartisan pride. There were people who were not even Republican, or maybe even some cases apolitical, who wrote in, writing letters or sending telegrams, just again saying thank you, for representing us. Even if they didn't agree with him on every issue, they really just were happy to see a Chinese American in the U.S. Senate. Again, some more here. Across the country, right? From New Haven, Connecticut to Stockton, California to, of course, people in Hawaii, or in this case, the one on the left, people in Philadelphia. Again, he had these very, what seemed to be very strong ties to benevolent associations and Chinese associations, Japanese associations, Filipino clubs. What was interesting, I will say, that I did not come across in the archive as it relates to this, is that it didn't seem he had unless someone in the audience might know otherwise, a very deep tie to Native Hawaiians. And it didn't have that same type of relationship. I'm kind of curious. He really leaned more in the Asian American side and less on the Pacific Islander side. And so I would love to know if there was more outreach on his part. But it seemed as though many of his supporters that were in Hawaii and elsewhere were, East and Southeast Asian, right? And again, you can see again, obviously when you're running for office, you want to reach to as many populations as possible, but certainly in Hawaii, a lot of his advertising and constituent mail and kind of newsletters and things like that were multilingual, right? In Japanese and Chinese, in English. And really, again, I think, especially when he started to receive more competition, if you will, from Japanese Americans, he started to really double down on advertising in Japanese periodicals. I noticed that as well, right? And so another historian, Judy Wu, some of you might know her. I ran into her at a conference recently, and she was saying, because she wrote a book about Patsy Mink. And she did a little bit of research and said that, it seemed like Hiram Fong was really scared of Patsy Mink. And kind of like she was kind of becoming this star in Hawaii, and he kind of had to kind of keep an eye on her. Of course, you had other figures, Spark, Matsunaga, and others, but he seemed particularly worried about Patsy Mink. At least that's Judy Wu's impression, and so we kind of had an interesting kind of giggle about that. One of the last pieces I want to show you was this letter. This was a translated letter from Mrs. Betty Go Lau. Again, this is just one of so many I came across. But it really, if you can read this here, really highlighted how a lot of admiration he received, praise he received, that is, from Chinese Americans. Again, I really want to emphasize that point. And I don't want to romanticize it either, as if that all he did was get all this praise and love and attention. And but that was something that I came across a lot going through his papers. Now, to be fair, right? Sometimes, people leave things in these archives and they take some things out. There was a share of criticism that he shared, letters that were left behind and mail. But it especially when it came from Chinese Americans, throughout his time in the Senate, there were a lot of letters that came in expressing their gratitude, if you will, for him. So it seemed as though he had a unique relationship with Asian Americans, broadly speaking, across party lines. And I will say that, in a post-Watergate America, where civic trust has just always been on the decline since Watergate, it's kind of interesting to see, right? A time in which people had a lot of faith in their leaders, right? Political scientists often say that after Watergate, or Americans' trust in government just declined and has really not picked up since. And of course, with the Vietnam War as well. Here's one figure who had clearly, at least in some of the documents, built a unique relationship with constituents and people who didn't even live in Hawaii. So to conclude, I look forward to hearing any comments or questions. These documents are not fully representative of Fong's political career or ideology. And like any public official, his views throughout the 1960s and 1970s changed as the country overall grappled with tumult and cultural transformation. However, these primary sources, along with other records, similar records I found, provide substantive clues and highlight crucial themes for understanding Fong's logic, perspectives, and worldview amid the paradigm shifts of a globalizing Hawaii and US. Hiram Fong was not the only Asian American conservative of his time, but he certainly inspired subsequent generations of right-wing and right-leaning Asian Americans who were able to harness their power to new heights as we approached a new century. In Hiram Fong's Asian America, there was a possibility for Asian Americans to be fully included in the national polity, albeit one that heavily relied on racial inclusion, heavily relied on both a strong Pacific orientation and a strong pledge of loyalty to the American nation state. So I will leave it there for now. Hopefully what I found in the archive and what I've shared today kind of has given you some food for thought, and I'd love to hear any comments or questions that you may have about research at UH. So thank you so much for being here.